When we talk about Israel as a light to the nations, I think we need to contextualize that, because the notion that we represent an exalted state of morality, that this country is a world beacon, I would urge us all to tone that down a bit and to take a long and hard look in the mirror.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. The October 7th massacre and the subsequent war against Hamas, other Iran proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, and Iran itself, caused many people throughout the Jewish world to reconsider what Israel means to them and what kind of society Israel should create. For me, I continually return to the idea that Israel should be a light unto the nations, an or laGoyim, or a Medinah lemofet, an exemplary nation and society. Although, given the rampant anti-Israel and antisemitic attitudes that pervade societies across the globe, it's unlikely that many plan on using Israel as a model for their own behavior, we still do have a responsibility to do so for ourselves, so that even if other people despise us, we are confident that we are creating the most ethical and moral country on earth. Yossi Klein Halevi, a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, recently composed an article for the Wall Street Journal which offers a somewhat different perspective. The article concludes by arguing that rather than concentrating on being a light to the nations, quote, "For now, in this summer of dread, the urgent question for Israelis is how to be a light to ourselves." In other words, we need to concentrate primarily on healing the schisms and problems within our own society. If we believe that being a light to the nations is not a goal, but an extant reality, then we're lost. Yossi gave me a lot to think about, and his opinions about how Israel should move forward are simultaneously disturbing and hopeful. The hallmark, that is, of deep thinking that both acknowledges the reality that we face and the miraculous and unpredictable presence of God. I'm sure you'll find this conversation as thought-provoking as I did. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, this episode of the Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by Nishmat, the Jeannie Schottenstein Center for Advanced Torah Study for Women. Nishmat is back with its new semester of online Beit Midrash learning starting September 8th. Study Talmud, Tanakh, Halacha, and more with some of the best Torah teachers in Jerusalem, all from the comfort of your home. Classes are open to women of all learning backgrounds. People who listen to this podcast know how much I respect Nishmat and its graduates. I interviewed Nishmat's founder, Rabbi Tankin, in episode 111, entitled Yotzot Halacha and Women's Roles in Learning and Leadership. My wife Aliza is a Nishmat graduate, as is my daughter Meira, and I am invariably impressed with the strong education that Nishmat provides. So join Nishmat for the upcoming semester of online Beit Midrash learning. For a full class schedule and registration, see the link in the description of this podcast. This episode is also dedicated Leiloi Nishmat Nachum Zev ben Gavriel HaKohen. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Last week I released an article entitled None, where I gave an example of a very unconvincing argument that's sometimes used to justify ultra-Orthodox exemptions from the Israeli army. I then wrote, quote, "If the Haredi leadership wants Israel's non-Haredi Orthodox population to respect their anti-army attitude, never mind giving money to the yeshivot, which encourage this behavior, they need to present reasoned halachic justifications rather than pointing to random agadic sources and insisting that the rest of us trust the Torah intuition of Haredi Gedolim." Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is co-host, together with Danielle Hartman, of the Hartman Institute's podcast For Heaven's Sake, the #1 Jewish podcast in the English-speaking world. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller and has appeared in a dozen languages. He has written for leading op-ed pages in North America and is a former contributing editor to The New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in the North American Jewish community and on North American campuses. He co-directs the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim leaders in North America about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 150 Muslim leaders have participated in this unique program. Born in Brooklyn, Yossi received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife Sarah, who helps direct a center for Jewish meditation. They have 3 children. Yossi Klein Halevi, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
I want to open up our conversation today about what Israel and Zionism should be by citing something that you wrote about a week ago in the Wall Street Journal in an article entitled Survival Nation, Israel's Summer of Dread. It's a worthwhile article that everybody should look at. I want to just read a few of the last lines that you wrote. You're discussing something, a movement called the Fourth Quarter, which is trying to bring Israelis from across the political spectrum together in order to talk about what Israel should be, maybe a centrist party of sorts. I'm not sure exactly. You spoke with someone there named Yoav Heller. I'm going to quote what you said. I recently attended a meeting in a Jerusalem home with Yoav Heller, a Holocaust survivor and chairman of the movement. Many of those present had been active in anti-government protests and were skeptical about dialogue, saying that the priority should be to topple this government or to deal with the existential threat of ultra-Orthodox power and separatism. Schism isn't only an Israeli problem, Heller replied. It's a world problem. We Israelis can create a model for how to manage seemingly irreconcilable differences. We are, after all, a people sustained by memory. We've been in this situation before, and we know the consequences of unrestrained divisiveness. If any nation can navigate its differences, surely it's the Jews. We can be a light to the nations, he concluded. For now, in this summer of dread, the urgent question for Israelis is how to be a light to ourselves. And Yossi, in those words, you have really encapsulated the dilemma that I'm dealing with myself. Right now, what should Israel's priority be? Should we continue to try to be a Medinah lemofet, an exemplary nation that sets the standard for morality and ethics for the world? Or is our job right now simply to survive and to make sure that we don't tear ourselves apart and that we don't fall into that destructive schism that looks like maybe on the horizon?
Well, when we talk about Israel as a light to the nations, I think we need to contextualize that, because the notion that we represent an exalted state of morality, that this country is a world beacon, I would urge us all to tone that down a bit and to take a long and hard look in the mirror. For the last 2 years, we have been led by a government, which is a meeting point of ultras, ultra-nationalists, ultra-Orthodox, and ultra-corrupt. I would also add ultra-incompetent. And when thinking about the title of your fine podcast, Orthodox Conundrum, this happens to also be Israel's first de facto Orthodox government, not officially, but a majority of the coalition Knesset members are Orthodox. The agenda of this coalition is overwhelmingly right-wing Orthodox. And so I think that the Orthodox community, first of all, needs to ask itself a very hard question. If this is the first Orthodox government in Israel's history, and Israel, 2 years into this government, is a shambles, both internally and along our borders, what does it say about the ability of the Orthodox community to govern, to lead the Jewish people? And since talk about the Jews as a light to the nations tends to come mostly from the Orthodox community, my question is very simple. Take a look at the reality and how do you square that with this very noble aspiration, which too many Orthodox Jews actually believe is not an aspiration, but a reality. And so that's my first question. And my second question here, and this really relates to the point you raised, is when we think about what it is that will make us a light, is it creating a Torah state, a theocracy ruled by halakha, a state that will actually end up alienating at least half of the Israeli population, maybe lead to a massive immigration of young secular Israelis? Is that your idea of a light to the nations? Or is it instead creating a society that reflects the irreconcilable diversity within Israeli society, that reflects the fact that we came back from 100 diasporas and 100 very different Jewish experiences, and every Jewish community came here with a different idea of what a Jewish state is supposed to be like? And won't we be a light to the nations if we figure out how to coexist, how to manage all of these radically disparate notions of who we are and what we're supposed to be, rather than trying to impose one idea on Israeliness? And here, if I could, Scott, if I could just make one last point. What I see happening in the Orthodox community is a repetition of the disastrous mistake that Mapai, the Labor Party, made in the early decades of the state, which was to try to enforce this uniform notion of what a, quote, real Israeli is. Now, for Mapai, a real Israeli was a secular kibbutznik. That was the ultimate, that was the ideal Israeli. And to this day, Israeli society is paying the price for the enforced attempt to remake, especially Edot HaMizrach, the Jews coming from Muslim countries, and to turn them into proper secular socialist Israelis. It didn't work. It never works. And so this notion that one part of the Jewish people can be entrusted with the political and cultural formation of the state of Israel has now been proven twice to be a disaster. So light unto the nations? No, let's first be a light unto ourselves and figure out what that means.
There are a lot of important things I want to comment on regarding what you just said. Certainly, you and I are of the same mind when it comes to the Orthodox effect on the Israeli psyche, and in particular, what's happened because of the Orthodox participation as political parties in the government. I have been very vocal on this podcast about how I think that the biggest threat to Torah Judaism is the existence of Orthodox political parties. I think it's a terrible thing. It's a threat to Israel, and it's a threat to Judaism itself, in my opinion. We don't have to get into that now, but we're certainly agreeing on that particular point.
So you don't vote for Orthodox parties?
On principle, no.
You know, the last Orthodox party I voted for was Meimad in 1984, 85. And that was it. And even if Meimad were running today, or a Meimad-like party, which is to say a meeting point of liberal and orthodoxy, I would not vote for that party. Because for exactly the reason you said, bringing in religion into the political system is a disaster for both, for both the religion and politics.
Unquestionably. Now, let me point out, I do not think that means that Orthodox politicians should not run for office. I mean, there should not be political parties defined as Orthodox parties. Orthodox politicians in otherwise general Israeli parties is fine with me, and even a good thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, one of the things which you mentioned, which really resonated with me, was the mistake when people, often from the Orthodox community, but perhaps outside of it as well, believe that the idea of or laGoyim is not an aspiration, but an existing reality. Now, that doesn't mean we should denigrate ourselves and say that we're the worst. It's not Yom Kippur where we have to say Chatanu Avinu Pashanu no matter what anyone says. But once we believe our own PR 100% and say we are already there, we have already accomplished the things that we need to do, and if we haven't, it's because of them as opposed to because of me, we have a serious problem. But what I say when I talk about a Medinah l'mofet, I'm not personally talking about a state run on halacha. I'm talking about what I would call ethical ideals that are universal. Now, of course, we can get into a philosophical discussion whether such a thing exists. I personally do believe in that. I believe that there are certain ethical and moral principles with which all people of goodwill can agree. And accordingly, our job should be to take the Torah ideals in the realms of ethics and morals. I'll just throw out a few examples. Right now, something which bothers me and I hear not spoken about enough, I believe that Yehuda Glick speaks about this a lot, which is that Israel sells arms to countries that use them against their own populace, countries that are totalitarian in nature. That should not be allowed. Or another example, the fact that Israel, to my knowledge, has never recognized the Armenian genocide because they're trying to be nice to Turkey. At this point, I'm not sure what the point of that is. But for a long time, perhaps that was justifiable because Israel was isolated.
You missed the boat on that one.
Right, exactly. Didn't accomplish what we wanted. But for Israel to continue not to recognize it publicly, these are moral mistakes. At least in those areas, Israel should be the most exemplary nation. And finally, in terms of Inyana Dioma, the thing we're dealing with today, the way that Israel conducts war. Now, of course, I think that Israel is being extremely moral from everything I understand. Warfare is inherently a dirty and inherently very bad situation. It's always a b'diavad, so to speak. It's not something which we want. Israel is doing everything that it can to conduct this war in an ethical and moral manner. And in spite of the canards of an anti-Semitic world and media corps, which will find ways to describe things that Israel is doing as war crimes, I think that's absurd. Israel is doing everything it can in order to conduct this war in a moral manner. That doesn't make it perfect because things are never perfect in warfare. Nonetheless, do you believe that Israel must continue to be the exemplar in these various areas and more?
Well, let's look at the war in Gaza. I trust the IDF. I trust most of the officers. I certainly trust the senior command to uphold the IDF tradition of struggling within the context that we find ourselves to have the most moral position. Now, that doesn't mean unnecessarily risking the lives of our soldiers. There's lots of room here for legitimate argument. I also think there's lots of room for legitimate argument about arms sales. I don't necessarily would put a veto on our arms sales. I think we need to be practical. We need to look at the reality. And we're a country that, aside from Ukraine, there's no other country in the world that is facing the kind of existential threat that we do. So I think that one needs to build that into these kinds of calculations, along with the nature, as you mentioned, the nature of the war in Gaza is that we are fighting an enemy that is completely entwined with the civilian population. There is no distinction. I'll give you an example. Almost a trivial example. A friend of mine coming back from Gaza said, I asked him, so tell me what it's like. He said, we were on patrol one day and we came across a water purification installation that had a plaque on it that said, a gift from the people of Germany to the people of Gaza. He said, we found the opening inside the installation to a tunnel. Now, that's really almost an inconsequential example, but precisely because it's so mundane, I think it's really telling that the civilian infrastructure has been co-opted by Hamas. And so just the other day, Israel bombs Hamas school. Never mind that this school was not in session. Never mind that there weren't students in this school. Never mind that it was a Hamas headquarters, and never mind that we pinpointed our attack. And not only that, we released the names of 31 Hamas terrorists who we know for certain were killed in that attack. And yet, the headlines around the world, Israel bombs another school. In other words, we have a track record here. We attack hospitals and schools and mosques. Yes, we do. We attack buildings that were hospitals, schools, and mosques and have been expropriated by Hamas. So I trust that the IDF is doing the best it can. Now, the fact that there will be isolated examples of outrageous acts against civilians committed by undisciplined soldiers. That has happened in every one of our wars. I can tell you, as someone who's studied our wars, who's written about our wars, that is just part of the nature of warfare. And the IDF, to its credit, doesn't accept that as a norm. What worries me are two things, and they're both related to the government. The first is when examples of outrageous individual behavior on the part of soldiers is exposed publicly. There's a growing tendency within our political echelons of this first Orthodox government in Israel's history to publicly defend and embrace those being accused, for example, last week, of sodomizing a Hamas terrorist. Now, I believe in the full measure of the law against Hamas terrorists, but that's the law, not vigilantes sticking whatever they were sticking up the rectum of this Hamas terrorist. Never mind whether he deserves it or not. We as a society don't deserve it. Even Eichmann was given a trial and a lawyer and due process of law. And so what the far right in Israel, that is no longer a fringe, they are ensconced in this government, supported by large parts of the Likud and tacitly by Netanyahu himself. The norms that they're trying to change would destroy any claim that we have to being in some way exemplary. And again, the fact that so much of the Orthodox community, in the name of supporting our soldiers, is willing to jettison the basic rule of law and any pretense of morality in how we conduct ourselves is astonishing to me. The other problem here also concerns the government and its relationship to the civilian population in Gaza. You know, I recently came back from a long lecture tour in the US, which included speaking on some of the more problematic campuses. And my impression of much of the discourse in America on the war in Gaza is that there's no Hamas in Gaza. They're all innocent civilians. And it's as if Israel has decided to wage war on 2 million innocent Palestinians. The problem is that the discourse on much of the right in Israel is exactly the opposite. There are no innocent Palestinians. There are no civilians. They're all Hamas. Smotrich, our esteemed finance minister, the other week said without shame that it may well be the moral thing to do to starve to death, his exact words, 2 million Palestinians until they release our hostages. Never mind the unbelievable stupidity of these people sabotaging the work that those of us who are out there trying to defend Israel. It's like placing a muzzle on us. It is cutting our legs off. But let's look at it really from the moral point of view. Now, if you were to ask Smotrich, should we aspire to be a light to the nations? I'm sure he would say no. We shouldn't aspire. We just are. Of course we are. Our inner nature, you hear that in certain circles in the Orthodox community. The inner nature of the Jewish people is simply to radiate. We radiate morality, godliness, and so we just have to be ourselves. Never mind if Smotrich's self is the antithesis of a credible moral position. How many people in the Orthodox community were applauding Smotrich? How many people in the Orthodox community were applauding those who stormed 2 army bases last week in support of the alleged sodomizers? So where are we, Orthodox community? You really want to have this conversation in 2024, 2 years into this government, with Ben Gvir and Smotrich representing religious Zionism? This is the conversation we should be having, that we are a light to the nations. What about looking at reality? What about looking at where large parts of the Orthodox community have led the Jewish people and are leading the state of Israel?
At some point during the beginning of the war, someone from Otzma Yehudit, Ben Gvir's party, had suggested, he later said he didn't mean it, that it may be necessary to nuke Gaza. I wrote a post on Facebook saying that this is morally outrageous.
Mind nuclear blowback because you can't control.
Let's ignore the stupidity of the policy. I'm speaking purely on a moral level. On a Friday night, after I posted this on Facebook, somebody I know from the community, a good, upstanding member of the Orthodox community here, passed by me and he mentioned offhand, "Oh, I didn't realize you were an ultra-leftist." At first, I didn't know what he was talking about. And then as he spoke, I realized he was talking about my Facebook post where I said that it was a moral problem to nuke Gaza, to say the least. That is considered by somebody who's a nice guy, a regular upstanding member of the Orthodox community, to be a sign of ultra-leftism.
In parts of the Orthodox community, what normative human beings would call morality is seen as ultra-leftism.
That's part of the issue, and I want to ask you about that, because part of the problem is, and I'm not defending anyone who will try to undermine conventional morality or Torah morality or any morality. Part of the problem is when Israel is held to an impossible standard, and we see this over and over again. I'm just going to read you the headline of an article which is in the Washington Post from, I believe, yesterday. It said, "How an Israeli hostage rescue that left scores of Palestinians dead unfolded." This article is basically a hit job on the rescue job of Israeli hostages. One of the crazy things that are mentioned there, it says in this article, they had a Hamas spokesman saying basically, Israel said, well, they're putting in residential areas. They're putting the hostages in apartment buildings. And he said, well, what are we supposed to do? Gaza is only 2.5 inches long. And the answer is maybe don't take hostages. I mean, that's your defense. And they print this in the Washington Post as some kind of reasonable response that Israel killed so many civilians. And while Hamas maybe shouldn't put them in civilian areas, it's kind of understandable. What else are they supposed to do? So when Israel is being treated with the kind of moral absurdities that other nations would never be expected to uphold, sometimes people just say, this is ridiculous. They almost say what you said. Let's be a light unto ourselves and forget everybody else.
I really understand that emotional response. And when you are on the receiving end of a lynch mob, which we are, it's very hard to be self-reflective, very hard to be self-critical. And there is the understandable impulse to say to hell with it. And if we're going to be judged no matter what we do, then let's just go for broke. Now, that is an understandable emotional position. It is not a credible religious position. And the shift that we see happening by here, it's actually not most of the Haredim. Ye'amer l'schutam, this is really coming from the religious Zionist wing, is to cloak this kind of understandable but essentially immoral frustration and rage in a religious language and justification. And that is corrupting Judaism.
I'll mention something else which happened just yesterday. We're recording this on the day after Tisha B'Av, and let me make it clear, I actually don't approve of people praying on the Temple Mount for numerous reasons, both halachic and practical. But leaving aside my personal stance on that, yesterday Itamar Ben-Gvir went on the Temple Mount and basically declared a new policy that Jews are now allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. The prime minister said that's ridiculous, and Ben-Gvir essentially said, I'll do whatever I want. Now, leaving aside the specifics of the politics there, what we have here is a very strange situation, because on the one hand, we have Ben-Gvir doing something which is, in my mind, aside from the halachic issue, let's leave that aside, or the halachic issue vis-a-vis the Temple Mount, in terms of the protection of Am Yisrael in Israel, it is dangerous. People can pretend that it's not, but I think that pretending this doesn't ignite fires in the Arab minds of those people who live here, it does. It's used as PR. It's used as a means to show that the Jews want to take over the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, and therefore it's a dangerous thing. Whether that's fair or not is a different question. But along with that, the U.S. State Department actually said, and I'm quoting, this is a statement from the State Department yesterday, the U.S. stands firmly for preservation of the historic status quo with respect to the holy sites of Jerusalem. Any unilateral action like this that jeopardizes the status quo is unacceptable. Now, forget everything that I said a moment ago about the inadvisability and halachic problems with praying on the Temple Mount. Here we have the U.S. State Department, the exemplar of exporting religious freedom across the globe, saying that Jews praying on the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism according to every Jew, is prohibited and must remain prohibited, and doing so is unbelievably a type of provocation that must be outlawed. What we have here is a moral morass. On the one hand, I don't think Jews should pray on the Temple Mount. But the fact that the United States is confirming that, I say it as a religious Jew, I think it's a bad idea. The fact that a secular government of the United States that believes in religious freedom says, yeah, but Jews can't pray on the Temple Mount, there's an absurdity there that can cause people to easily go in on ourselves, say, forget the outside world, forget what they call conventional morality. And while I don't approve of that, I can understand it and say, the whole world's going to get at us no matter what we do. We may as well do what we want to do.
Well, interestingly, here again, one has to cite the Haredi parties who took a principled position against Ben Gvir on the Temple Mount. So I've now credited Haredi parties twice in the last 5 minutes. For me, that's really an old. But credit where it's due. You made a very important point, and then I'll address the larger question. But I don't want this other point to go unnoted, and that is that this really is a danger to Jewish life. And what I've noted over the years is that when you have riots in Jerusalem from Palestinians, it almost always is connected to the Temple Mount. Whether there's a real change in the status quo or an imagined change, that ignites Palestinians in a way that nothing else does. And again, I'm speaking very specifically in Jerusalem, where by and large, you can walk the streets here and more or less feel safe, even during war, which is an extraordinary accomplishment of the state of Israel, actually, and it needs to be acknowledged. In terms of the larger question of the Temple Mount, we failed in repeating the extraordinary concession that Israel made in 1967. We should be mentioning this at every opportunity. There is no country in the world that did what we did in 67. You're a victorious army. This is your holiest site. It's the third holiest site for Islam. And yet we imposed restraint on ourselves. Now, we did it for two reasons. First of all, the government did it because it wanted to try to downplay the religious dimension in the conflict. And secondly, the religious establishment did it because of the long-standing prohibition on walking the Temple Mount, which over the years has been increasingly eroded, certainly within religious Zionist circles. Now, all that is true. We did not do it for altruistic reasons. Nevertheless, that's an astonishing concession. And I don't want the world to take for granted the fact that we prohibit ourselves from praying at our holiest site. That's something that needs to be noted over and over again. Now, that is separate from Ben Gvir, who truly is a pyromaniac. And, I can tell you from my association in the very distant past with Mayor Kahana, who actually Ben Gvir never knew. He was a generation younger than those of us who were with Kahana in the early 70s. Kahana's dream for the Temple Mount was to trigger the apocalypse. And he believed that the only way to bring the Mashiach was for the Jewish people to commit acts that were so outrageous, whether it would be expelling all the Palestinians or destroying the Dome of the Rock, acts that would isolate the state of Israel, leave us completely alone in the international arena. And only then, when we prove that we're not afraid of the non-Jewish world, would God intervene and send us the Mashiach. Now, meanwhile, ma lasot, what can you do? There would probably be an apocalypse, but God would protect us. That was Kahana's insane political platform. Now you have to understand, for 2,000 years, when Jews were in a position of powerlessness, we devised all kinds of fantasies about the end of days, all kinds of apocalyptic ideas. And that was understandable when we had no power. The moment that you merge power with apocalyptic fantasy, you are really treading on very dangerous ground, because that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meir Kahana wanted to bring the apocalypse, and the trigger for him was the Temple Mount. Itamar Ben-Gvir knows this. This isn't the language that he's speaking. Ben-Gvir is very clever. He's a lawyer. He knows how to sell Kahanism light, L-I-T-E. He knows how to sell Kahanism to desperate Israelis who just are looking for some way to feel safe. And so he is offering Kahanism in its earlier incarnation. It's a kind of an Israeli version of the JDL with this undercurrent of the later Kahanism, Israeli Kahanism, of the apocalypse. And it all focuses on the temple.
Let me just give a shout out to, I think it's your first book, though I can't be sure, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. I bought it when it was released, and it remains one of the most entertaining and informative books I've ever read. And I strongly suggest that people read it. If I can say so, it's a lot of fun.
I actually think of it as a post-Holocaust comedy.
It's a fascinating and very enjoyable book. I highly recommend it. It reminds me of something I once heard you say, Yossi, in an interview. I hope I get this right. The interviewer said something about how you moved from the far right politically to the left, and you corrected him, saying that's not true. You moved from the far right to the center, which is a much more difficult maneuver. Moving from the far right to the far left really means remaining in a state of extremism, just a different kind of extremism. Moving from either extreme to the middle is, I'm going to say this now, a much more courageous move.
Thank you. And, what makes the center hard is that it requires a lot of work, because you really have to think through the positions of the left and the positions of the right, and you have to take them seriously. And you have to listen. You have to listen carefully. You know what? The right is right about that. And, during the Oslo years, I was opposed to the Oslo process. I felt this is a disaster. I wasn't a right winger, but I felt these guys are seeing through the process. They understand that we've basically brought in Jack the Ripper and called him a peace partner. And so it's a question of looking at each issue legufo shel inyan, on its own merit, and saying, okay, here I'm with the left. I think that ruling over 3 million Palestinians is a catastrophe for the state of Israel on so many levels. And yet, creating a Palestinian state under these conditions with this Palestinian national movement is unthinkable. And so to constantly ask yourself, who's right about what issue? And that really is it's a tremendous strain, and it's much easier to line up with my cultural camp. Well, if I'm Orthodox, then I'll just be right-wing down the line. Or if I'm secular Tel Avivi, I'll just be left-wing down the line. That's not taking our dilemmas seriously. That's imposing an ideology and wishful thinking on reality. And for me, what Zionism is about is very simply dealing with reality, the Jewish people taking responsibility for our fate. And that means taking responsibility for reality.
In that case, Yossi, let me ask you about the current reality, the one you just mentioned, the one where ruling over 3 million Palestinians is an absurdity and extraordinarily dangerous for the Jewish character of the state of Israel and more. And creating a Palestinian state under the current conditions is an absurd misunderstanding of the current political situation in the Palestinian world and inviting future October 7ths and worse. I think many people would agree with both of those statements. How is there a way to balance those? How is there a way to merge them together? What is someone supposed to do? I'm at a loss myself.
Well, there's no chance, I believe, no chance whatsoever for a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli peace agreement. That's over. It was over before October 7th. October 7th definitively ended. But there's something else happening in the region, and that is we are moving toward the gradual end of the Sunni war against Israel. Now, for most of Israel's existence, the conflict was defined by the Sunni world's refusal to accept Israel's legitimacy. The Abraham Accords were a milestone in the beginning of the process of accepting Israel's legitimacy. Now, we have peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. They're not real treaties. They're more like glorified ceasefires. But the Abraham Accords are real peace agreements. And by the way, this is the first war that Israel has fought that I can think of where no Arab country that has signed peace agreements with Israel recalled its ambassador from Israel, including Egypt and Jordan, which really surprised me. So something fundamental is changing. If the Saudis come into the peace process, then we really are looking at the effective end of the Sunni war. Now, we are facing a Shiite war with some Sunni allies. For example, the Palestinian National Movement, Hamas in particular. And so we're really looking at a shift in Israel's fundamental strategic balance of power. I don't know how the Palestinian problem can fit in to this transformative regional peace that's taking shape. And I don't know if the answer is a demilitarized state or if it's some kind of joint rule by Arab armies, the Israeli army, a Palestinian police force, whatever the configuration is. It opens up possibilities that were unthinkable before. And there's one more thing that I just want to add about the need for hope in the future. And this is really a message to the Orthodox community. 50 years ago, the leading threat to the state of Israel was coming from the oil-producing states. In the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC countries, led by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, imposed a crippling oil boycott on the West. And the purpose was to turn us into a pariah, and it nearly succeeded. Arafat speaking at the UN a year later, the Zionism Racism Resolution in 1975. These were all outgrowths of an atmosphere of growing isolation for Israel. If you had told me then that fast forward 50 years, the oil-producing Arab states are going to be leading the movement for normalization with Israel, I would have thought, really, there's a limit to Jewish wishful thinking. And I would have said, you're just a leftist. We're still in my Kahana period. And yet here we are, 50 years later. And let's acknowledge the possibility of change. And as a religious Jew, let me say, let's acknowledge the fact that God can actually work miracles and transform situations that seem completely hopeless. And let's also have a little bit of humility. We don't know how things are going to turn out. When I hear from the right, there'll never be peace, I said, really? How exactly do you know that? How can you be so sure about anything in the crazy reality that we live in this country? Everything that's happened here, good and bad, has been inconceivable. So let's have a little bit of humility and let God do some work here.
I really appreciate that message of hope, because that has been something I've heard too seldom in the past 10 months. Hearing something like that really is encouraging for me. So I thank you. I know we don't have much time. I want to ask you a couple more questions. One of them is about exactly that. When you talk about God's role here, you have been an exemplar of interfaith dialogue. You wrote a book entitled At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, and I want to quote the first sentence of the epilogue, because I believe it came out in 2001. And then the madness came. This is before 9/11. 9/11's in your introduction. You're speaking about the Second Intifada, when your forays into various Christian and Muslim communities in Israel, particularly the Muslim communities, came to an end, simply because it was impossible to have that kind of dialogue given the situation on the ground. So given what you just said about God and let God do his work, do you think there's any hope at this point, when the madness then is almost quaint compared to the madness now? Do you think there's any hope for interfaith dialogue with Muslims in the future?
In the future, as we say in the Middle East, God is great. But right now, at this moment, I personally don't have the energy to reach out. I am, I wrote a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. This was in 2018. And as a result of that book, I get calls every so often from mostly foreign journalists who want a perspective of hope. They say, so tell me about, your relationships with Palestinians. And I said, listen, right now, I would not be able to write that book. I said, I don't disagree with anything I wrote there. I'm very glad the book is out. And I hope that someday soon I'll be able to emotionally reclaim that book. But right now, I would not be able to reach out to Palestinians and write that book. And so at this point, not only are we at war, we're fighting a two-front war. There's the war against genocidal enemies on our borders, and there's a war against a global movement that is providing the ideological support system for the genocidal war against Israel. And when our narrative, when the Jewish story is under such sustained attack, I'm in no mood to say, well, I'm trying to understand the Palestinian narrative. I'm not interested right now in understanding the Palestinian narrative, in having a dialogue about our competing narratives. That's not for this moment. Again, I hope that in future it will be possible. But right now, emotionally, that's not where I am. At the same time, I do have friends, including some heroic figures in the Orthodox community, who are continuing to reach out to the Muslim world. And I envy them. I wish I had the strength to do that now. Right now, I am in defense mode. For me, it's really, I see my work at this moment as trying as best I can to defend Israel in the media, in whatever forum I'm able to. And the other work, God willing, will have its time.
Okay, Yossi, as a final question, let me just ask you, given what you just said about defending Israel in the media, how do you balance, because this is something which I struggle with, how do you balance defending Israel as it should be defended, while at the same time not pretending that Israel does not have faults? Sometimes when I mention something about, let's say, Ben-Gvir, which I disagree with, people will say to me, how dare you say that in public? You're just showing Israel's bad face to the world. On the other hand, I think that people are going to find out anyway, and it's better that we call it out and show that's not who we are. What's your methodology?
So when I talk about Israeli democracy to audiences abroad, especially campuses, what I'll say immediately is that Israel is not a paragon of objective democratic values and practice. And then I say, the reason for that is our circumstances. A country that has found itself from the first day of its existence under existential threat, that goes from war to terrorism, to boycott, to siege, to war. That country cannot possibly be America. But what Israel, I believe, is a paragon of is the struggle for democratic norms under near impossible circumstances. And that means that context is everything. What the anti-Zionists do to Israel is they remove us from our context, the context of a country that is under constant existential threat, and judge our actions objectively. Look at what Israel is doing. Yes, Israel is doing terrible things. But if you don't understand the context, if you erase the context, then what you're left with is a series of crimes. Then Israel invades, we invade our neighbors, we oppress, we destroy. We're a criminal nation, unless you widen the frame and you include the circumstances. Now, one of the things that I think is, I think this is a very Jewish argument, because rabbinic Judaism is based really entirely on circumstance. Talmud is an argument over circumstances. You have the objective halakha, but now let's bring it into the real world. There's what happens if this circumstance. Okay, but what about if that happens? And the Gemara will sometimes go to almost absurd lengths, offering these really fantastical examples to make a point, which is circumstances everything. And so what our enemies are doing is trying to erase the Talmudic logic of context and judge us in this ludicrous, objective way where there is no circumstance. So for me, circumstance is everything, and even more so when it applies to Israel.
Okay, Yossi, the Talmudic logic of context. That's fantastic. I really appreciate your time today. And as you know, Yossi, I've mentioned this to you privately, I really respect the work that you do, and I really enjoy listening to your words of wisdom. I get a lot out of it, and I'm sure my listeners will as well. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Scott, thank you so much for the great conversation and for everything you're doing to try to restore the decency that is so deep in the Orthodox community, but to restore it to the public discourse of the Orthodox community. And somehow the decency that's in the community often gets lost in the transition to the public space. And so really thank you for what you're doing.
I appreciate that. Thank you. This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by Nishmat, the Jeannie Schottenstein Center for Advanced Torah Study for Women. Nishmat is back with its new semester of online Beit Midrash learning starting on September 8th. Study Talmud, Tanakh, Halacha, and more with some of the best Torah teachers in Jerusalem, all from the comfort of your home. Classes are open to women of all learning backgrounds. Everyone who listens to this podcast regularly knows how much I respect Nishmat and its graduates. In fact, I interviewed Nishmat's founder, Rabbanit Henkin, in episode 111, entitled Yoatzot Halacha and Women's Roles in Learning and Leadership. My wife, Eliza, is a proud Nishmat graduate. My daughter, Meira, attended Nishmat for 2 years. And I'm invariably impressed with the strong education that Nishmat provides. So join Nishmat for the upcoming semester of online Beit Midrash learning. For a full class schedule and registration, see the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.